Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. It's the varsity athlete Jeremy Bodette coming to you with a very, very special report outlining some incredible and disturbing claims that have been made against Vince McMahon. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a couple of things right from the get-go. First thing is, these are not my opinions. I am not passing judgment. I'm not claiming that any of the things that I'm about to review here are right or wrong, truth or false. That's not the purpose. The purpose of this is to take the 64 or 65 pages of the lawsuit that was filed in late January and read it, understand it, condense it down, and share it with you guys. So I don't want anybody to misinterpret this as any kind of endorsement or support of either side of this. I'm going to attempt to be as objective and non-biased as I possibly can in describing this to you, but the lawsuit itself is, of course, written in a biased way. So it's almost impossible to avoid. If my opinion is included, I'll be sure to share that very directly and transparently so that it's very easy for you guys to separate what's being claimed in the actual lawsuit versus what does the varsity athlete think about this particular thing. I think most of my opinion is going to be shared at the end of this video series. The second thing I want to mention is that this is an incredibly disturbing story. If true, if even only part of it is true, it's extraordinarily disturbing and extremely unique. The lawsuit shares testimony in very graphic detail, much of which is not included in the review that I'm going to be sharing with you in this series. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the claims, it is almost impossible to avoid a lot of what's going on. There are very detailed and disturbing descriptions of rape and other disturbing circumstances that just can't be avoided, unfortunately. So please have discretion, not just of yourself, but of those around you, and just make sure that the only people that are listening to this are people that should be listening to it. So without further ado, let's get started. This is the fall of Vince McMahon. Hey gang, welcome to this very, very special report that I, Jeremy Bodette, the varsity athlete, have put together for you guys. As you may or may not know, very recently, a woman named Miss Janelle Grant filed a very salacious lawsuit against Vince McMahon, John Laurinaitis, and WWE Corporate with some very incredible claims. And I'm sure you've seen piecemeal what some of those claims are, but what I think it needed to happen was somebody needed to sort of put their rubber gloves on, dive deep into this terrible topic, and try to provide some perspective. You know, one thing that we try to do in wrestling with the business is try to connect the business side with the show side. And if there's one thing, if there's two things I can say about this lawsuit, one is extraordinarily disturbing, the claims, and two, it draws some very interesting connections between sort of the real world and the kayfabe world of professional wrestling that you'll see as we go through. So just want to go through the parts. It looks like it's probably going to be about a 13-part series that we're going to be going through with you guys. I just want to briefly review each part with you and just talk very briefly about what each one's going to contain, and then we'll go into part one. Part one of the fall of Vince McMahon is called A Not So Chance Encounter. That's what we're going to talk about now. That covers the events of March 2019, where our story begins. Part two is called The Grooming Begins. That covers the spring-summer of 2019. In part three, we're going to discuss is called Miss Grant Goes to Stamford. That covers early summer 2019. Which discusses her being hired by WWE and her initial experiences with the company. Part 4 is called Escalation. This covers the events of the summer of 2019. Part 5 is called The Doctor is Sin, which covers events from the fall of 2019, basically talking about how Vince McMahon basically brings a celebrity doctor into this situation and the doctor's clinic. Part 6 is called Cat and Mouse. It covers the events of winter and spring of 2020. Part 7 is called The Sex Trafficking Begins. This covers the summer and fall of 2020. Part 8 is called John Laurinaitis Enters the Frame. This is where we see the third named defendant in the lawsuit, John Laurinaitis, enter our story. It covers fall 2020 all the way to summer of 2021. This section of the story is pretty extensive. Part 9 is the assault at WWE HQ. That covers a very specific event that occurred in June of 2021. Part 10 is called Grant Meets the Talent. That covers the events of summer into winter, so kind of the second half of 2021. Part 11 is Mrs. McMahon and the NDA, which basically covers the remainder of the story, winter 2022 to present. And then subsequently, I wanted to review with the group. I thought it might be helpful to do a wrap-up kind of review where we talk about just kind of the specific claims that she is making, which are quite extensive and very detailed. And I think once you kind of get to the end and you see those claims, it kind of makes a lot of sense why this entire, frankly, lurid and unpleasant tale needed to be told, and it needed to be done publicly. And I think that the lawsuit itself kind of addresses some of the criticisms that people typically make about lawsuits, like it's frivolous, why is it coming up now? Those kinds of questions kind of get answered by this section. And then, of course, part 13 is the fallout, which even as I record this right now, we are still kind of understanding what that fallout is. And of course, like Cody Rhodes, the story is not over yet. And so we will only the future will tell us what happens at that point. Okay, so let's go back up to the very top and let's get started with this story. So this is part 1, a not so chance encounter, which covers the events of March in 2019. So let's meet our protagonist. So our protagonist in this story is a woman by the name of Miss Janelle Grant. The lawsuit does not give very many details as to her personal situation, except to say that she recently experienced a very difficult personal loss, the loss of both her parents. In addition, and again, we don't have any specific details on what caused this, but there was financial hardship associated with that loss that led to a bankruptcy, which led to the loss of her childhood home, which the lawsuit claims created some very difficult situations for her. Caring for her ailing parents left her in an unemployed situation. So the picture that gets painted here for Janelle early in the story is that she is a very vulnerable person. At this point, I believe she's in her late 30s. She's 38 or 39 years old. She's just lost both her parents. She's lost her childhood home. She's had to deal with the trauma, not just of the loss, but of the bankruptcy. And she's attempting to cope with these traumas that she's dealing with. The residence manager of the residence manager of the building that Miss Grant lives in knows Vince McMahon through some weird happenstance. Vince McMahon is, of course, WWE's co-founder and executive chairman at this time. Keep in mind, this is in early 2019, so Vince still very much in control of things. This is pre-COVID. This is a full year before the COVID lockdowns. So Vince is still very much in control. I know a lot has changed in the last 3 or 4 years in regards to WWE with the TKO merger and everything. But at this time, it's the old guard. Vince is still in 100% control of creative. There's input from other people, but he's still flying around, making last-second changes as people are standing in Gorilla on Monday nights. I mean, all that nightmarish stuff that we remember of yesterday, that's the reality now. Miss Grant often ran into Vince's 2 personal assistants as they both lived in the same building. So you kind of have 3 connections. You have the residence manager that apparently knows Vince McMahon personally, and then you have Vince's 2 personal assistants that live in the building with Miss Grant. As a matter of fact, one of Vince's personal assistants, Grant claims she knew because they went to grade school together. So there's even kind of a personal historical connection there. The residence manager reaches out to Vince. It's not really outlined specifically what is said or what messages are shared, but basically she says, hey, I have this woman. I think she's really great. All this stuff. I think she could be a really good fit for you and your organization. Would you like to meet her? And he responds enthusiastically, yes, I would love to. On March 23rd, 2019, we have the first meeting, the first of many, many, many meetings between Grant and Vince at his condo. This is his personal residence. This is where he lives. Supposedly, it's supposed to be an interview. At least that's the understanding that the lawsuit gives. And basically, they sit down in his condo, and she shares her personal story, right? The tragedy that I went over at the beginning of this video, right? The loss of her parents, the loss of her childhood home, her unemployment, her financial struggles, all that stuff. And Vince shares a lot of his personal information too. He shares a story about growing up poor, his poor upbringing, his difficult marriage with Linda, who he is now estranged from. He lives in this condo now. He doesn't even live with his wife, unfortunately. And basically their first meeting ends with Vince not just promising her a job, which presumably is what Grant expected when she had the initial conversation with the residence manager, but that he's going to give her, quote, a life. He offers her and her residence manager tickets to this year's WrestleMania show, which she is surprised by, but accepts. And she leaves that initial meeting feeling very encouraged, feeling valued. At that time, Vince doesn't make any kind of advances on her, physical or otherwise. There doesn't seem to be any kind of inappropriate touching. Obviously, having the meeting or the interview in his residence is inappropriate. That's my opinion. I don't think too many people would disagree. But that is, that's how that ends. She's very excited, and it would appear that, hope springs eternal. So that is part 1. So a little bit of background on Janelle, a little bit of information about their initial first meeting. And as you can see from the initial first meeting, things seemed very kind of weird, kind of off, but mostly innocuous. And as what I think you're going to see going forward when we enter into part 2, which is coming up next, which is called The Grooming Begins, what you're going to see is this very steady escalation of contact between the two of them. And what you're going to see is this kind of, the picture that gets painted by the lawsuit is, as Vince McMahon grows in influence over her life, she kind of shrinks down. And she becomes smaller in the frame, and he becomes this very domineering figure in her life and begins to control nearly every aspect of her life. So please tune in next time. We're going to get to part 2. If you've been with us for this long, please hang on. Please check out part 2, where we're going to break down the spring and summer of 2019 and talk about the events that take place there. In the meantime, you keep watching, and we'll keep wrestling with the business.